Good afternoon. My name is Tony Thompson. I'm a law professor here, and I'm the director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law. Welcome to this afternoon's Latham and Watkins Forum. We're excited to have you here. This is quite a special day, and I'll say why in just a moment. But I want to introduce my panel. At my far left is Miriam Krinsky. She's the founder of Fair and Just Prosecution, and she'll talk a little bit about that organization. I'm going to skip over the middle person on my panel and introduce Marilyn Mosby, who is the elected state's attorney for Baltimore. And it is with great pleasure, and I want you to join me in congratulating the newly elected Philadelphia District Attorney, Larry Kraft.
Is this your first official elect?
And you all in this room should feel some great pride, because this is the first event that Larry is attending upon his new election. So he should get credit for that. What we're going to do today is we're going to spend about 40 minutes in a conversation. And your role is to eavesdrop. And after 40 minutes, we're going to open it up to Q&A. And I'm going to start that conversation with a series of questions. And I haven't told my panelists what I'm going to ask them yet, which is why they probably look a little nervous seated to my left. But our idea is for there to be a conversation here and for that to broaden out with you guys. So let me start with the broad question for all of you. Each of you has had a different path in running for district attorney, or in your case, Miriam, starting Fair and Just Prosecution. Can you speak broadly about how your past work has influenced your vision of what the criminal justice system should be and the role of the district attorney? And Marilyn, let me start with you.
Sure. So for me, I can say that it was more of a personal sort of traumatic experience that kind of led my path. I come from generations of police officers. My grandfather was one of the founding members of the first black police organization in Massachusetts, so law enforcement was very much ingrained within my being. But when I was about 14 years old, my cousin, who grew up with me like a brother, we both had aspirations of being first-generation college students, and he was killed right outside of our home in broad daylight when he was mistaken as a neighborhood drug dealer. If it wasn't for a neighbor who cooperated with police, testified in court, my family wouldn't have received any sort of justice. But having to, and I had gone to the police station with my mom and my dad and my uncles, but having to go into the courtroom and seeing my cousin with all these dreams, all these aspirations, who's now going to a grave, and understanding and recognizing that the individual responsible for his death was also 17 years old. What was perplexing to me was the fact that you saw all of these African-American men coming in and out in chains and shackles. And it was at that point that kind of sparked my interest and my intrigue, because I wanted to understand how we could have gotten to that young man before he elected to take my cousin's life. And so it was that traumatic sort of experience that spawned my passion. And I said, well, what is this system? How can we reform it? And that's what started it for me.
Larry?
Well, so, I mean, certainly there were personal experiences not as compelling as Marilyn's, but basically I came out of law school having done law for homeless people and having done law for indigenous rights, and I became a public defender in a city where the only course that you could take if you wanted to do justice in the criminal justice system was to be a public defender, because we were in a city where the DAs have publicly made statements about how passionate they are about the death penalty and have consistently been very draconian. There's a very long history in Philadelphia of racial division and of a very, how shall I put it, biased approach to law enforcement. So I was a public defender in the county for 3 years, in the Fed for 2 years, and then at that point, having had some very close connections with ACT UP, which was in its early days and was raising Cane very successfully in a mission that it hasn't completed but has achieved pretty successfully all along. I became involved in representing protesters, activist organizers, decided I needed to be in my own civil rights firm in order to do that, and I also wanted to be in my own civil rights firm to be able to sue police officers, not because I don't like police officers. I do like police officers. I just like good ones. I have an allergy to ones who lie, cheat, steal, and do other terrible things. So that's what I did. 25 years in my own practice of doing criminal defense, civil rights. We are talking in court 4 to 5 days a week for 30 years now. And that means more than 10,000 clients. It means literally thousands of trials, including everything from underage drinking to death penalty, triple murders. And so how did that form it? Well, you're in court all the time. I'm sorry. Okay. So how did that form it? When you're in court all the time and you see what's actually going on, it's not that hard to figure out. And that's why I ran.
Maren.
So thank you, and thanks to all of you for joining us for lunch. So I came to the work that we're doing at Fair and Just Prosecution really having seen two bookends of the justice system. So I spent a decade and a half as a prosecutor. I was in the federal, in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I went into that work in part because the Federal Public Defender's Office wasn't hiring at the time, but in part because I really felt a calling to be part of public service. And what I saw over the 80s and the 90s was a justice system that just wasn't really getting it right. I saw increasing numbers of young people, especially young people of color, coming into the justice system, and they were falling into a dark tunnel. I saw increasing piling on of penalties, of mandatory minimums, of sentencing guidelines, where there was less and less ability and discretion to look at the individual, to figure out what was right and just in an individual case. And we weren't doing right, not simply often by that young person, but we also weren't doing right by the community. We weren't making our communities any safer. We were spending billions of dollars on incarcerating generations and destroying families in the process. And I really felt that we needed to do better and left that work in part to try to reach that young man, Marilyn, that you talked about, to do work with young people in the child welfare and juvenile justice system through a legal services organization that I had the privilege of running. And what I saw there as well were young people who were coming into systems that, again, was often tearing apart families, bringing in young people and not returning them to our communities in any better place. So I really felt like this work and this moment that we're going to be talking about later is something that we had to seize, and that we have to do better and come back to this work with a feeling that if we can't help prosecutors get it right, then we really should be giving up on what we all, I think, are committed to, or at least many of us, in terms of criminal justice reform.
As we talk about reform, let me say, for decades, to win the office of district attorney, you had to tout being tough on crime, conviction rates, how many people you were going to lock up. Larry and Marilyn, you both ran on campaigns of criminal justice reform. Marilyn, you became the youngest prosecutor elected in the country. Larry, you won despite the largest paper in Philadelphia endorsing your opponent. What do you think led to this change of philosophy and your relative success at the polls?
So what I can say is that I think we're kind of seeing the importance of a role of a prosecutor all across this country. Prosecutors are the ones who decide who's going to be charged, what they're going to be charged with, what sentence recommendations they're going to make. They make a decision as to whether or not the person even gets into the criminal justice system in the first place. And when we look at the disproportionate sort of impact that the criminal justice system has had on communities of color, you cannot ignore the fact that 95% of the prosecutors in this country are white, 79% are white men, and as a woman of color, I represent 1% of all elected prosecutors. Having that experience, being a black woman raising two little girls in the heart of West Baltimore, someone asked me earlier, where do you live in West Baltimore? 2 blocks away from where that uprising took place. The experience that I brought, having the personal experience, the law enforcement, and just my background, I can say that for far too long, prosecutors have had these decades-old of field policies, tough on crime, and it's led to mass incarceration of nonviolent drug offenders mostly, right? We have not taken a holistic sort of approach and gotten to the root causes as to why crimes take place. And I'll utilize my city, for example. Baltimore is a city that is one of the richest states in the country, but 24% of Baltimore's population lives in poverty. 35% of children live below poverty. Oftentimes we hear the numbers. We hear 344 homicides, 314 homicides. You know, we're well past 300 and we're not even out of the year quite yet in Baltimore, but we don't talk about the unemployment rate for young African American men between the ages of 18 and 24, which is more than twice as high than that of whites. We don't talk about the 18,000 vacant houses, 16,000 vacant lots, which are already in poverty-stricken communities in Baltimore City. And because we haven't had that dialogue for so very long, we haven't made that investment in our young people, what we're seeing is this violence and this surge in violence. And people are looking for overnight solutions when none of this took place overnight. But the power of a prosecutor is to be able to take a holistic sort of approach and to start to address those systemic issues. So yeah, we have a traditional role of being reactive. And that's what we can do. We can be tough on violent individuals. And I can say in my office, despite all of the negative sort of perception of Baltimore City, my prosecutors prosecute 50,000 cases a year in Baltimore. We have a 93% felony conviction rate. We've convicted every single public enemy #1 that's been designated by the Baltimore police as the worst of the worst. Those 11 individuals, another 5 that's still pending, 6 life sentences plus 598 years. You can do that, and you should do that. But we should also be looking to ensure, like you said, Miriam, that we're getting to young people before they get to the criminal justice system, ensuring that individuals who have already served their time are not deemed second-class citizens for the remainder of their life. And you can implement programs like Aim to Be More for first-time nonviolent felony drug offenders, where they go through a probationary period where they learn life skills and job training skills. They do community service, and at the end of that probationary period, they're given a job and their felony records are wiped clean. I've gone to over 1,000 community associations and schools. Like, it's so important for us to be able to invest and see young people in classrooms as opposed to courtrooms. Those are just some of the things that power, that awesome power of having that prosecutorial discretion affords you.
Larry, let me ask the question a different way. How the hell did you win?
It is unthinkable, isn't it? How did I win? Well, so I think it's something that I tried to figure out as we had more and more success and as it went on. There's a political answer, but I also think there's kind of a historical policy answer. The historical policy answer is, what do you think happens when you become the most incarcerated nation in the world, when your national population in custody is increased 500%? What do you think happens when the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has a 700% increase? And what do you think happens when you have the poorest of the 10 largest cities, which also has the highest rate of incarceration of the 10 largest cities, and in 2014 had the highest murder rate? What happens is some people actually read the report card and see that that is failure, okay? That's part of it. Another thing that has happened, and I've been lawyering for 30 years, so I've kind of been a witness to this car crash, is that we are at the point where 1 out of 3 black men will experience jail in their lifetime, and 1 out of 17 white men, and 1 out of 18 black women, and 1 out of some much bigger number white women. There is this tremendous difference between the experience of my main voter, my best voter, according to all my political consultants, was an African-American woman, probably about 60. And what has she seen? She's seen her brother, she's seen her father, she's seen her kids go out the door, and they either have actually ended up in jail or she's been concerned that they would end up in jail for basically her whole life, or at least the last 30, 40 years. What does that mean? Well, it means that she has had to be the glue. She has watched the devastation. When a person is arrested, gets a felony young for something not that serious, is forced into a cycle of poverty and pushed back toward crime, and then that happens to all the kids who grew up with your kid on the block next to your block and on your block. In other words, she has seen that this system doesn't just fail to prevent crime. This system causes crime. This system causes poverty. African American women are famously good voters. Philadelphia has a 45% population of African Americans, about 45% white, and about 10% other folks, Latino and Asian mostly. So they voted. That was, frankly, probably my best voter. Second best voter was a millennial. And we all know how they feel about Bernie in 50 states. So, but they feel that way for some reasons. And, you know, among other reasons, they would like their public schools for their kids. Thank you very much. They would like a lot of things that we used to have. I went to public schools, and when I went, I came out with 22 kids in a class. You go to the best magnet school in Philadelphia, 33 kids, 35 kids in a class, which is completely unfair to the kids and the teachers. So millennials were the second group, and surprisingly enough, the third group in this remarkable coalition was working class white people, the most endangered portion, the most endangered species in the Democratic Party, who were canvassed. In other words, instead of using the high-handed and highly ineffective tactics of the conventional Democratic Party, namely big TV ads, people went door to door, knocked on the doors, talked to the homeowners, and we found out they didn't agree with me on the death penalty. They like them some death penalty, but they agree there's too many people in jail, and this white population has a whole lot more compassion around an opioid, heroin, fentanyl epidemic than there was around a crack epidemic 30 years prior. And they have seen that once there were better schools and that this economic impact is affecting them as well. So that's kind of a long answer, but the bottom line is that was the coalition. It made no sense to any of the political operatives, but that's because political operatives don't know what they're doing, and activists and organizers who were essentially the volunteers and the team, activists and organizers, are better at politics than politicians, and that's how we won.
Let me suggest that I know that many of my students are having a crisis right now because a lot of the students here are going to run back and look at the poster to make sure you all are prosecutors and not defenders. and there'll be an opportunity for you to talk about what they want the experience to be like for interns and young lawyers in their office at the end of this conversation a little bit. But Miriam, I want to come to you. I still think the philosophy that I've heard from my two colleagues here is the minority philosophy in terms of elected officials. But do you notice any general trends during your time with FJP in the shift in the types of platforms that are winning DA's elections nationally?
Yeah. So I think we're starting to create the beginning of a new normal. And this is an oddity, but we're hoping it's going to be less so. And I think that we are at a crest that's going to keep hitting the beach with future waves. And my organization does not work in the election area, but there are others out there doing work that will hopefully continue to see generations and future Larrys and Marilyns coming at us. So we are seeing a different type of mindset. I mean, as Marilyn said, you know, the norm prosecutor does not look like either of these two. I mean, it looks more like Larry, but it doesn't think like Larry. It doesn't walk and talk like Larry, but it sure looks like Larry. Sorry.
That's quite all right.
Maybe not with blue jeans on, but we are starting to see a critical mass begin to form. The prosecutors that we work with, by and large, believe that our justice system is too large, that we can't incarcerate our way out of mental illness, out of poverty, out of drug abuse, that this is not a partisan issue. There are individuals on both sides of the political platform who believe that we know what doesn't work, and spending millions and millions of dollars on prisons and incarcerating our way out of every societal ill is investing in courtrooms, not classrooms, as Marilyn said, and doing it in a way that has not left our community safer. We know that as prison populations are going down, that the crime rate is at all-time lows, and that in those parts of the country where they have embraced a different starting point and are more in a tough-on-crime mindset, they haven't seen their crime rate going down to the same extent. So we know what data is telling us, and I think we are starting to see a new group begin to form who took on incumbents, who beat incumbents, who have broken through glass ceilings, who are firsts. We are starting to see that old presumption that once a DA is elected, they have lifetime tenure, that 95% of incumbent DAs will win re-election and 85% won't even get challenged. That's changing, and not that I don't want some incumbents, you know, to be unchallenged, but even incumbents who think about things right need to have people holding their feet to the fire. So I think we're starting to see a new kind of thinking that embraces the view that people shouldn't be defined by the worst thing they've done and never given a second chance. So I believe that this mindset is going to start to show proof of worth and that others are going to follow suit.
So I want to drill down a little deeper now. all alluded to the fact that mass incarceration is a huge problem in this country. And the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Within this problem, there are profound racial disparities. If we take out longer-term solutions like diversion, midnight basketball and stuff like that, are there things that you think we can implement, immediate steps to address these racial disparities within offices? Miriam, are you seeing them nationally? Larry, you haven't yet taken office, but are there things you're planning to do or thinking about? And Marilyn, are there things that you're doing?
Sure. Do you want to start with?
Sure. So, I mean, we're looking to have a longer conversation in August here with Tony and Vincent and the center around exactly those issues. We're looking for a few good law students. We'll talk about it later who may want to work with us on that. I think there are a variety of strategies that we need to be thinking about. I think we need to be embracing a starting point that doesn't have a bail structure that keeps people in custody because they're poor. And frankly, we have debtors' prisons around our country where people are kept in custody, not because they're a flight risk or a danger to the community, but because they can't afford a cash bail that is set based on schedules that have nothing to do with community safety. We know that those bail schedules disproportionately impact communities of color, communities and individuals that are struggling with poverty. So we're starting to see, we had a group of our prosecutors that we work with sign on to an amicus brief that stood up and said in a case being litigated out of Harris County, Houston, Texas, that cash bail is wrong and it's unconstitutional. We had the new sitting DA that we're working with in Houston switch positions and take on the side of the plaintiffs in her county who are suing her county to try to deem her cash bail system unconstitutional. We're seeing newly electeds coming in representing a different face of the office and understanding that they need to be hiring individuals in their office who reflect the diversity of their community because, you know, as that great saying in To Kill a Mockingbird recounts, you can never truly understand somebody until you've walked a mile in their shoes. If the offices and the leadership don't reflect the community, it's inevitably going to lead to a certain kind of thinking that's not reflective of the best interest of their communities. We're starting to see offices and leaders who are willing to stand up and be transparent about their data, look at it, assess it, and come to terms with it. We're seeing elected leaders who are willing to stand up to past racial injustices and apologize for the role that prosecutors have played in that history. So we're starting to see some different thinking taking shape, and I think there's more to come.
So, I mean, this is kind of a huge question because the entire system, frankly, beats down people of color and beats down poor people. And needless to say, there's considerable overlap. You can almost itemize the aspects of my platform, and you'll see over and over again, it beats down the poor. Death penalty beats down the poor. It is incredibly racist in its application. Mass incarceration, I mean, I agree with everything Miriam said, but there's also this sort of, in Pennsylvania, California, and some other states, there's this interesting depth to it, where one might think that Pennsylvania being, a Northeast state known for being democratic, one of the largest states, would be maybe better than the national average with mass incarceration. Well, it's not. It's worse. And the reason it's worse is that the state legislature is Republican and conservative. And so they're the ones who are approving the sentencing guidelines. And those sentencing guidelines are providing 13,000 Philadelphians to be in state prisons across the state that are not in Philadelphia. And those sentencing guidelines have the convenient effect of feeding the local economy of the Republican legislators who are sending Philadelphians there, and they also, in the next census, will have this result. Human beings from Philadelphia, overwhelmingly of color, will be housed all over the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and they will be counted as residents of those other counties. And that will be there for various purposes, including gerrymandering and potentially highway funds. So for people who cannot vote because they've been convicted of felonies and are disqualified in Pennsylvania and sitting in a jail cell, we'll count them as voters. And for people who cannot drive because they're sitting in a jail cell and cannot drive, we'll count them as drivers. And these other counties will get all kinds of bucks and all kinds of political pull off of passing guidelines that are clearly excessive. All right? I mean, it gets deep. When you really start looking at it, it gets very deep. And so, one thing that a DA can do in Philadelphia Since the sentencing guidelines do not require judges to sentence in those ranges, they simply require that they be considered, is the DA can march assistant DAs in there on at least most offenses and say these guidelines are excessive and they're political, and we're recommending sentences that are lower in those cases that we prosecute. I mean, there's a whole myriad of things. There are certainly discretionary decisions that are made within prosecutors' offices that are racist or that are abusive to people who are poor. You know, I mean, it's very common to hear someone say, well, he doesn't have a job. I mean, you know, why should we give him diversion? He doesn't have a job. Really? I don't know about this one. This one lives in a high-crime neighborhood. Really? That's how you're going to make these decisions? So there are so many aspects to this, but fundamentally, you got to get at it from about 14 different angles.
So when you talk about the racial disparities in the criminal justice system, I mean, there are so many, as you stated, DA Krasner. Especially right now in the sort of divisive times in which we currently live, we have a federal administration that's touting regression as making America great again on the backs of Black and brown people. And I can tell you that as a prosecutor, you know, we are on the front lines of reform. This is the one time you all are law students that you can appreciate the word federalism, right? And states' rights. This is the one time that we should appreciate federalism. You know, when we look at some of the conservative sort of movements, they've done this for a while. States' rights, states' rights. That's the only way any sort of progressive reform is going to come on these state and local elections. We can forget about that. We know that they would love to be back and tough on crime, on nonviolent drug offenders. We can't afford to do that. And that's the importance of the role of a prosecutor. And so when we talk about immigration policies, like Marion brought up, you know, you can be at the forefront of that. I signed on to the amicus brief in Chicago where we sued Attorney General Jeff Sessions and basically said, you don't have the ability to require that we locally impose your egregious immigration policies and then tie our federal funding to it. You know, I instructed my prosecutors to consider the collateral consequences of these egregious immigration policies when exercising their discretion. And twice was referenced by the Attorney General for being a rogue prosecutor for doing so. You know, when it comes to bail reform, we can be at the forefront of fighting that and saying, no, it shouldn't be based upon, you know, somebody's income, and it should be whether or not they're flight risk, right? You can be at the forefront of all of these issues, and you should be at the forefront when it comes to conviction integrity, you know, ensuring that we're not only as prosecutors advocating for those that we believe are guilty, but ensuring that we're also advocating to exonerate those that are wrongly accused and convicted. In my office is the only conviction integrity office in the entire state of Maryland, where we've had 2 exonerees, one individual who was wrongly accused and convicted of murder who was incarcerated for more than 17 years. Then just a month ago, another individual was incarcerated for more than 13 years. Imagine giving up your life and you didn't do anything wrong. Well, we proactively do reinvestigations through this unit to ensure that we're not keeping people who are wrongly accused and convicted of crimes. When we talk about legislative advocacy, that's something that, again, you have the ability to utilize your platform as a prosecutor to ensure that if the sentencing guidelines are wrong, and we go down to Annapolis or wherever your state legislature is and advocate to ensure that we don't have discriminatory laws. When we talk about the recruitment, I can tell you that, you know, it's been a mission of my office to get diverse sort of attorneys that are coming on, that are mission-oriented, that believe in justice over convictions. It's not just about conviction rates. It's about understanding and recognizing that you're basing your discretion on the totality of what's in front of you and recognizing that your role, that awesome amount of discretion, not only affects defendants and victims, but has collateral consequences on our communities. So when we talk about even the racial disparities, and this is something that I was talking with you, Professor Thompson, about, is I'm open to bringing in the MacArthur Foundation or whoever else wants to work with me, and so we can talk about, you know, these racial disparities in the criminal justice system and opening up these case files. We're currently working with the Quattrone Center and the University of Penn Law so that they can do a root cause analysis to ensure in our conviction integrity unit, they took the young man that was incarcerated for 18 years as a case study so that we can figure out how we don't ever put ourselves in this position again. And the one thing I can say is that you just have to learn how to, like, not take it personally, right? I'll apologize on behalf of the criminal justice system because that's what I represent now as a prosecutor.
So Larry, something that's been made, your opponents tried to make hay of, and I think has been overplayed a bit. But you sued the Philadelphia Police Department over 75 times in the past. How do you think these interactions are going to shape your ability to work with them now, starting in January? As the city's top prosecutor.
Well, so first of all, let us be clear, the Guardian Civic League, which is the African American Police Officers Association in the 4th largest police department in the United States, endorsed me. Thank you very much. There's a real division in Philadelphia. There's a long and troubled history of policing in Philadelphia. We had a police officer named Frank Rizzo who became the police commissioner, who became the mayor, who basically kidnapped the city and dragged it to the bottom of the ocean with infinite pensions for police officers that have, frankly, almost bankrupted the city. There's a huge controversy in the city right now about whether to remove his statue, which is the only statue of a modern mayor that is near City Hall. And that is because he is viewed as the Confederate General of Philadelphia by many of us, including me. So we have a long and troubled history with policing. And the fact is that the Fraternal Order of Police, which is the union that's supposed to represent all police officers but seems to do a much better job with its white members, is the bargaining unit. So they have a mouthpiece, and that mouthpiece is the leadership, and the leadership don't like me, and the leadership don't like me. Well, let's not say that part of it. Let's just say our paths crossed 20 years ago in a police corruption situation when he was a narcotics officer who seems to have had information about narcotics officers who were corrupt. Let's put it that way. So, yeah, we're going to be hearing grief from him, but who cares? I mean, the reality is that probably the reason we have such a big fat margin in this election was the fact that I said I would never take his endorsement, and he didn't give it to me. Everyone who got his endorsement did very poorly in the election. The front runner had his endorsement, and the front runner finished a distant third in the primary. He endorsed the Republican candidate, just like he endorsed Donald Trump. Donald Trump took 15% of Philadelphia, and my opponent took 25%. So I don't think it really hurt. You know, the reality is the commissioners, the last 2 commissioners in Philly have been African-American men, extremely experienced, distinguished, capable, progressive, modern in many ways. We don't agree on everything, but Charles Ramsey is now a national figure. And Richard Ross is the commissioner. We get along real well. They have needed for a very long time to have a district attorney who would support them and not just pander to the police union, because the way you get elected in Pennsylvania and go from DA to senator or governor is by being elected statewide, and that means you want the Fraternal Order of Police all across the state to support you. We have a governor, or had a governor, named Rendell, who was a DA first, and then he was the mayor, and then he was a governor. We had another senator, Arlen Specter, who was a DA first, and then he was a senator. And then we had a couple of wannabes, in Lynn Abraham and Seth Williams, who ended not as well in terms of their careers. But the reality is every one of them was pandering to the FOP and much less concerned about the police department because they viewed it as a springboard to advance their own ambitions and careers. I don't. I'm just an old white guy who wants to be DA. So I ain't pandering to nobody. And the reality is that when they're simultaneously saying I can't get along with cops and I don't know how to prosecute, the only people who've been prosecuting cops in the last 30 years are a small cadre of civil rights lawyers, including me, Dave Rudofsky, and a few other people in Philly. So, hey, it is what it is. Call me crazy. I think one standard applies to everybody, and if cops are committing crimes, I didn't say mistakes, I said are committing crimes, then they're going to face the same fate as anybody else.
So, Marilyn, you received national attention for investigating, charging, and seeking indictments and prosecuting those officers responsible for Freddie Gray's death. How did you navigate the public reaction, the national reaction to that, and what would you recommend to prosecutors out there in the country that are thinking about bringing charges against law enforcement? So
the one thing I can say, I was 3 months into my term. I did not anticipate being thrust into the national spotlight after an innocent, I'll say innocent, 25-year-old black man by the name of Freddie Carlos Gray Jr. was made eye contact with the police and unreasonably placed into a wagon, head first, feet shackled and handcuffed, and then his pleas for medical attention were ignored. When I charged those officers, and I would do it again 1,000,000 times over, I didn't expect the backlash, right? This is before the current climate, where the racially divisive climate. So when I was receiving hate mail and death threats, when my husband was being described as being how he was going to die, and an obituary was sent to my office where they described how he would die coming out of my house, and that no police officers would respond, or I received hate mail that said, "You racist nigger bitch." Oh, excuse my French. It was a lot to kind of take in. But what I had to understand very early on is that you learn not to internalize it. And what I had to quickly understand is that it wasn't about me and a personal attack against Marilyn Mosby. It's what Marilyn Mosby represents, what Marilyn Mosby represents to the status quo. Again, those numbers are significant and they're real. 1%, that's what I represent, 1%. And so I think that there's a distinction between the police and the FOP, as DA Krasner has kind of outlined. You know, I'm not a fan of the Fraternal Order of Police. And they'll tell you in a heartbeat, you know, they actually started a super PAC in my local election. But the job of a prosecutor is very simple. You do what's right, right? That's the only thing that you have to get up every morning and look yourself in the mirror and know that you're doing what is right. And so I was okay getting up in the morning, dealing with all that I had to deal with, because in the end, I didn't see it then. I was very maybe naive because I felt like we were going to get justice, and in some respects we did. When we think about that accountability, which had not been had in this country, let me just say, we had accountability across the board, regardless of one's sex, religion, or occupation. Justice was being applied fairly and equally. Now, that accountability led to exposure. A week after I charged those officers, the Department of Justice came in, exposed the discriminatory policing practices of one of the largest police agencies in the country. That exposure ultimately led to reform. We now have a federally enforceable consent decree that, even with the forestalling of the federal administration that tried to forestall it, is now on record. And the actions and the culture of that department are different. So those individual officers weren't held individually and criminally responsible, but every single police officer is being held accountable for the actions of a few. I went into this to reform the criminal justice system, and I can say that we successfully did that in 18 months. But I do want to say that, you know, I think that we've distinguished. We're going to hold everybody accountable, right, regardless of who you are. At the same time, you have a codependence on the police department. So I talked to you all about kind of that 93% felony conviction rate. We would not have that if there was no sort of working relationship with the police department. So yeah, you have to distinguish between the fraternal order of police that are not going to be friendly towards somebody like me holding police officers accountable, and those hardworking police officers like my family who risk their lives each and every day for the constituents that they serve. And I would just say, even beyond Freddie Gray, we've had several other sort of issues. I don't know if you guys have been following, and you're not always going to agree. I think this is what's important, but you have established that you're still going to apply justice fairly and equally. I don't know if you guys have been following with the body-worn cameras. This is another issue that has been presented within my office that kind of Baltimore has set a precedence for. The reenactments of body-worn cameras and the discovery of evidence, or you pretending as if you discovered it for the first time, and 30 seconds before you did not know that the police camera was picking it up, and you actually discovered it 30 seconds before and put it back, and then came and left and came back, and you don't put that in your statement of probable cause. Well, I've gone on record and said, well, this is a misrepresentation of the truth. And if you don't put it in your statement of probable cause, and you don't say on the camera that it's a reenactment, it goes to your credibility. And because it goes to your credibility, and because it's a misrepresentation of the truth, I'm going to get rid of every single one of your cases, because now your credibility is now at issue. And so despite, you know, those times in which the commissioner has come out and said it's a bad call, I can honestly say that I'm going to always do the right thing.
So, Miriam, the proverbial elephant in the room that we've kind of glanced at but not talked about is the current administration's Department of Justice. And when we talk about that, and we talk, big elephant, I know. When we talk about that, and we talk about the aims and objectives of FJP, and we talk about the platforms that these two great prosecutors have run on, to what extent do we feel like the federal policies are impacting what you want to accomplish at FJP?
Yeah. Well, I think they're making it that much more dire. So when we started to conceptualize this project and sort of this new moment that was happening in races that we could see were playing out in a different way around the country, it was before the election a year ago. And I think there was still value at that time in trying to be sure that the rogues had a room full of rogues that they could talk to. So they had other people who were like-minded who could come together and sort of where they could find strength in like-minded prosecutors who think differently about these issues, where we could collect them on an amicus brief in the lawsuit in Chicago. And so one voice could become 20 voices. After the election a year ago, it was clear that progress that we had been seeing made around smart justice approaches, around a new way to think about how do we make our communities safer without making our prisons larger? How do we make our communities safer by realizing that a punitive approach is often not the best approach, the smartest approach, or even the most compassionate and economic approach? So after the last election, we started to see a turn back to the prior years and decades when I was prosecuting as a federal prosecutor, where if you can prove it, you're going to charge it and you're not going to plead it away. And that really strips a prosecutor of the ability to try to find the right pathway and the right resolution in a case, including often a resolution that means don't even engage in the first instance. I mean, I've often told people that our justice system should be premised on a starting point of, first and foremost, do no harm. And if engaging is doing more harm than good, then why are you engaging to begin with? So we've definitely looked at what's going on and concluded that any change that's going to happen, it's going to happen at a local level. And we need prosecutors like this who are willing to think about what is smart and just. We need prosecutors like this who, if a federal government is intruding on the rights and lives of immigrants and others, they're willing to say, let's look at those collateral consequences and think about, do we charge, do we arrest, what do we plead people to, and how and when do we give second chances? We need prosecutors who are willing to join their voice together and say, just as we would engage if local law enforcement is mistreating members of our community, if federal law enforcement is mistreating members of our community, prosecutors have a role to play. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're in a very different kind of landscape right now. And unless we come together and support prosecutors like this, which is the aim of fair and just prosecution, I think we're going to fall back far too quickly into where we were in the 80s and the 90s. And we know that that wasn't working. And so I don't know why we would want to return back, why we would want to live out Albert Einstein's definition of insanity, of doing the same thing over and over again, and somehow expecting that a different result is going to come about.
So I'm anxious to get the viewpoints from some of the folks in the room, but I do have another question, and hopefully in some of the questions from the room, hint, I want you to ask this question of how we get progressive people to run for DA. But let me ask all of you to reflect, and Marilyn, I'm going to start with you. When I look out in this room, there are a bunch of public interest-oriented students who want to advocate for criminal justice reform. To those that are thinking about maybe going into a prosecutor's office, what advice do you have for them?
So what I would say, and I didn't know, I told you from a personal sort of perspective, I wanted to reform the criminal justice system. And when I was in law school, I didn't know whether I wanted to be a defense attorney or whether I wanted to be a prosecutor. And I did clinicals. I worked in the defense clinic for more than a year. I did that, and I worked for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston, the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., the Suffolk County Homicide Unit. So I gave up, and I'm told that you guys get paid for these internships now. I didn't get paid. We had little pill, stipends, and my colleagues were making $40,000 in the summer. But I knew that I wanted to reform the criminal justice system, and I really wanted to follow my passion. And when we look at what we're currently in, I feel like this role is so very, very important. I think this is the greatest sort of position that you can be in. I honestly believe that systemic reform, and I do believe that the criminal justice system, sometimes these systems are created to dehumanize folks. Systemic reform comes from within, no matter what it is. And so when we look at why somebody would want to be a prosecutor, we talked about that before. Even D.A. Krasner mentioned the collateral consequences of these felony convictions. Young people, mostly young people, when they get felony convictions, they can no longer apply for a job. They can no longer apply for housing. They can't go back to school because they can't get any financial aid. And so when they make poor decisions, what other recourse do they have but to go out doing what they're doing in the first place? Prosecutors, prosecutorial discretion is so important on so many different levels. When it comes to legislation, when it comes to, that discretion, that awesome sort of power, I think that's the best place to be able to actually implement reform.
Larry?
So here's the thing. One of the problems we have is that a long history of draconian prosecutors have defined in your minds what a prosecutor is. Martin Luther King used to have a phrase which he used thousands of times, which is, if you want to fix a problem, you've got to get your mind right. You've been told a comic book version of what a prosecutor is. That's not what it is. A prosecutor takes an oath to uphold the Constitution and to seek justice. Lynn Abraham, who was our most infamous prosecutor, thought that meant arrest as many as possible, charge them with the biggest charges possible, convict as many as possible, give them as many years. That's not justice. It's never been justice. So when you think about the possibility of being a defense attorney, which is what I was thinking about when I came out of Stanford Law School, and you're thinking about the possibility of being a prosecutor, which I also thought about, understand that not all prosecutors are the same. Elizabeth Holtzman was, in many ways, a very progressive prosecutor in Brooklyn in her time. And you now are in a country where there are a lot of prosecutors in different cities. I won't list them, but I'm sure you know who they are, who are very different than that stereotypical prosecutor that you have seen on television that has been force-fed to you. I think you should consider very seriously, if you're already locked in, I'm going to be a public defender, or if you're not, I think you should consider very seriously a couple things. Number one, go to the website, KrasnerTransition.com.
Good plug.
I thought you were going to give him my website.
I knew he was going to do that.
That will be your turn.
You're a smart man, smart man.
KrasnerTransition.com has been in operation for less than 24 hours. But it does, in fact, accept uploaded letters of interest and resumes for anything your heart would desire. So please consider that. But more broadly, seriously think about what it might mean to be a part of a criminal justice movement that has the power. I mean, I've been representing activists forever, and unfortunately there's this aspect of activists, whom I admire greatly, which is they love their virtue and they love to fail. It's okay to win. It's okay, instead of beating your head against the outside of the DA's office like I've been doing for 30 years, to just go on inside. Think about it. Well, that's all I got.
Miriam, you get a chance now to talk about your new program.
Thanks. And actually, I want to comment for a second. It's also okay to redefine what is a win, and to reach a moment in time where Maryland doesn't have to say twice what her conviction rate is, because we don't care about her conviction rate. We care about doing the right thing. And so she has to keep touting that, because we live in a society still where that matters too much. So she should be touting how they're treating people, how they're shrinking the system, how they're diverting individuals, how they're bringing diversity and new thinking to her office. And the conviction rate, that should matter the least of everything. So I just want to say how we think about the win. Where we sit is where we stand, or vice versa. And unfortunately, you all can help us change that if you're willing to go on inside. So let me talk about how we hopefully can help bring some of you inside. And I know we've got a number of folks from our FJP team here with us. Do you want to just raise your hands and smile at people? They're there, they're here, they're everywhere, so catch them during a break. They're going to start to pass around information about us and about, we do more than just give a website address. We're going to give you parting gifts. So we have a summer fellows program, and we're launching it this summer in 3 law schools. This one, Harvard and Stanford, 3 unknown, schools out there. And how many of you think you want to be prosecutors? Okay. Okay, how many of you think you want to be public defenders or defense attorneys? It's okay, Edie, you can raise your hand still. How many of you think you want to be civil rights lawyers? Okay, I want to talk to you, that last two group of people. You folks, and not that we don't want to see those prosecutor wannabes, but we want to see individuals who think they want a career in a public defender's office or in a civil rights law endeavor. We want to invite you inside. We want you to spend a summer with a progressive prosecutor, like one of these folks. We are putting summer fellows into those offices. You're going to work more directly with leaders like this. You're going to do normal work, but you're also going to work on a policy project. And ideally, maybe you'll even start second semester, but you'll take it into your 2L or 3L year when you come back from that office. We're going to network you with other summer fellows, other Fair and Just Prosecution fellows. We're looking to create a diversity pipeline through our Summer Fellows program. And we're looking to try to bring in individuals who think the way these folks think and who can start to build a new generation in these offices from the ground up, to be expanded in next year thereafter. So we encourage you to find out about us more generally from our website, fairandjustprosecution.org, but we also encourage you to think about our Summer Fellows program as well, and we're happy to answer more questions.
So let me say, I know how this works, and I know when classes get ready to start how everybody bails, so I want to say some things I would normally say at the end. One, being at NYU, we take a lot of things for granted. The fact that these three folks are talking to you, these are rock stars, and you need to appreciate this is different. The other thing is, hearing Marilyn call Larry D.A. Krasner every once in a while has been such a great new experience. I'm tempted to just have her talk to him for the rest of the day.
New for me as well.
There are two mics that are going to be floating around. So if you have questions, raise your hand, get a mic, and this is your opportunity to ask a question. So please, questions. Over here.
Hi, my name is Lindsay. I'm a 2L. First, I want to say thank you very much for coming and talking with us today. So you talked a little bit about prosecutorial discretion and how in your offices you can use that power for good with the hope that it will also trickle down to the other DAs in your offices and they'll follow those policies. I'm wondering, to what extent would you be willing to limit the prosecutorial discretion that you have under the idea that in the future somebody less progressive may come into office, so to protect for future officials from using that discretion poorly?
So what I can say is we don't really limit the discretion. The only time that we'll limit any sort of prosecutorial discretion, and Miriam, you brought up a point, the reason why I tout my conviction rate is because, I mean, we still have a role to play in public safety, right? So I'm touting the worst of the worst that we are able to convict, and I don't want to lose sight of that because I still believe that prosecutors have to ensure, like it was the prosecutor's office that ensured justice for me and my family, right? Like, so when it comes to prosecutorial discretion for violent individuals, my prosecutors, they don't have limited sort of discretion, but we do have some sort of like oversight. We want to ensure that those individuals that are focusing on, have no code of ethics, killing women and killing children, that those type of individuals are held accountable. But with regard to limiting it to the point where it's non-violent offenses, it's a culture, right? Like you have to change an entire office. I have 351 employees, 212 attorneys. So anybody coming in, they would have to then formulate and say to them, you can no longer do this, right? So I think it's a process. I won't be able to say, you guys have to do it this way when I'm gone. Somebody else coming in is going to be able to implement their own sort of thought process in the way that they should handle cases. I hope that I answered your question.
I think it's, I think it's the kind of question we see in law all the time. It's a great question, but it boils down to something real simple, which is character. I mean, ultimately, there's discretion. It's either going to be determined by a legislature that tries to take it away from Aramis Ayala, so she can't use her discretion not to seek the death penalty, and there the discretion is in the hands of the legislature, or it's going to be in the hands of a prosecutor. The reason there's so much, in my opinion, the reason there's so much discretion in prosecutors' hands is because they've been draconian. The whole point was to let them be crazy, right? And now they got a problem because there's people like Marilyn and me who are actually going to be sensible about it, right? But you have the same situation when it comes to questions about appointing as opposed to electing DAs. I wouldn't have been a DA if I was appointed. The mainstream Democratic Party would never have appointed me, but on the other hand, there's no question that sometimes we have, hang 'em high Klansmen getting elected DAs. So there's always going to be this tension. I think fundamentally it comes down to the character of the individual, and I will be delighted to have as much discretion as I can have.
And from the top perspective, you set the tone for your office, right? And those that aren't willing to follow and are not sort of for progressive reform, they will vet themselves out and they will at some point leave. Take it from me, I know.
I have a mic on this side somewhere. Who's got
Hi,
a mic there?
yeah, hi, my name is Princess Umodu. I was just wondering what's the space kind of for prosecutors to work with like public defenders and defense attorneys, like to really reach the best result for the client, or not the client, but the person that you're prosecuting?
So I can say that I think it's extremely important to have, like, you encounter the same sort of defense attorneys time and time again. And it's crazy because when I was a line prosecutor, we had more of a cordial relationship when we were talking about people's liberty than when I went into the civil world and it was anything but civil. We were talking about people's money, right? But I do think that is really, really an important sort of thing to do. But that's my point.
I thought it was a good point. So, well, I mean, we've had this extremely adversarial notion of what defense attorneys and prosecutors do. It is adversarial. They have different ethical obligations. And, defense attorneys have to be zealous. But having said all of that, there is a model that's not nuts.
Right.
I mean, when you got the shredder going full-time in the homicide unit of the DA's office because they're shredding exculpatory statements, as actually happened in Philadelphia in the late 80s and the early 1990s, that is well beyond anything that can be ethically condoned. I'm pretty hopeful that we're going to be able to have a much better relationship, not only between the DA and the public defender's office in Philly, but also between the DA and, the reputable private counsel. Because you can do a lot. I mean, we are, in fact, all dealing with the same cases and hopefully all competent, and therefore we don't have to fight over every single thing.
And I remember my point, I'm sorry. The idea that we have to be so adversarial that, we're coming at it from two different perspectives. We are, but that's the beauty of being a prosecutor. Like, your job is to pursue justice, right? It's not just about that conviction. So we've, in my office, we have, I told you, the Conviction Integrity Unit. We've increased the grant funding by more than 27%. We have a Conviction Integrity Unit right now where we just received a grant where we're gonna be working with the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project to vet cases to see which claims of actual innocence we should be pursuing a reinvestigation on. Like, that's the kind of relationship that you should have. When it comes to the body-worn cameras that I talked about earlier, like, I don't know, it's a little political season, my election's coming up in June, but the public defender's office, you have to work with those public defenders. And not only do I have hundreds of cases that are impacted by those body-worn cameras in 3 different incidents where the officers were allegedly reenacting the scenes, but we then recently had 8 federally indicted officers that were robbing drug dealers, allegedly robbing drug dealers. Some have already pled guilty. And some of them are responsible for getting people killed, right? Actually going in masks and going into people's homes and robbing them. Again, I had to get rid of a number of cases, hundreds of cases, and it was that cooperation and that environment, that space with the public defender's office where we were proactively filing motions to vacate, convictions from years prior that relied on the testimony of those 8 federally indicted officers. So you shouldn't feel like you're in a space where it's so adversarial that you cannot work together, because your job and your mission as a prosecutor is justice. You should be working with them.
So let me add, thank you, that's a great question. And I think that, as both Larry and Marilyn have said, while the roles are different, the objectives are the same. And so we are at FJP working with NACDL, the Innocence Project, the National Juvenile Defenders, and other groups like that, because the objective is one and the same. And I think that also means we need elected DAs who are going to stand up and fight for funding for legal services and funding to ensure that public defenders and others are not so shortchanged that they can't fulfill their role. The other thing I would say is Hannah Gross from our team there is barring the door. We hope that you will fill in your evaluations about, give us some thoughts. She may let you out unless you do that, but I think it's a little iffy there. So, but we would love to have you fill those in and maybe drop them on the table back there before you scoot out.
We have a question right here.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here and for speaking with us. I have a question specifically for DA Mosby. At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned some statistics about the length of sentences your office has obtained for certain defendants. I'm curious to know what you think is achieved by those sentences and who benefits from them. If I may anticipate one potential response, because a moment ago you spoke about people who would kill women and children. Given the evidence that even people who do commit really terrible acts of violence age out of the threat that at one point in their life they might pose, if someone's sentenced to life without parole, if that's something your office has gotten with, for people, what benefit do you see to having people in their 70s, their 80s, people dying in prison?
So I can tell you that, having gone through that traumatic sort of experience where my cousin was killed, and this is an image that's branded in my mind to this very day, it impacts you for the remainder of your life. And I touted statistics again on those worst of the worst, the individuals, again, who have no code of ethics. So I'll give you an example. The public enemy number ones, these are known BGF, Black Guerrilla Family Prison Gang, executioners. So one of the individuals, he lured somebody onto a playground in broad daylight and shot him twice in the head in front of his pregnant girlfriend. The other individual, which is an individual that flipped me off and gave me the bird, because we were trying to send a message to the community, essentially killed 2 women in broad daylight after he got into a verbal dispute. This is a BGF executioner, right? Like, this is his job. He goes around killing people. Essentially killed these 2 women in broad daylight on a porch, and then critically injured another woman by shooting her in the head. She is permanently disabled as a result of the actions of this individual. So one of the things that I tried to do right away is to try to make an example, because again, your role as a prosecutor is traditionally to be reactive, but it's also to make our community safe. And what we know, and DA Krasner can attest to, is that it's a very small number of individuals that define the negative perception, at least of my city in Baltimore City, right? And so you have to be able to show that you're going to hold those individuals responsible, because they should be held responsible. I'm sorry, if you lure somebody onto a playground and shoot him twice in the head, that's an individual that I don't want living in my community. And so am I concerned with whether or not that same individual, when he gets 70 years old, is still incarcerated? No, I'm not. I'm just going to be candid with you. He made a decision to hurt somebody, and I think that there's a distinction that should be drawn.
We got time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah. Look, okay. Get a mic up for me. She'll give you a mic.
Hi, Hannah Howard, I'm a 1L. And so I'm kind of wondering how you navigate situations where survivors of crime actually want higher sentences maybe than you're wanting to give perpetrators. I used to work with survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, and a lot of people didn't want to go through the criminal justice system, but people that did often said, I want this person in jail for the rest of their life. And part of me said, yeah, I totally get that. And then part of me said what we know is that that's not effective. So I'm just kind of wondering how you navigate those tensions.
So what I can say is we level set expectations. One of the things that we changed in my office, because when I first took office, and you have yet to experience this, I'm sure you will, was that there were a number of phone calls that I was receiving almost immediately from family members and people who had not heard from their detectives or from their prosecutors, and their families were killed, right? These were homicides. And so what I essentially said was, this is such an important sort of role. People need to understand the way that the criminal justice system works so that you can level set expectations. My prosecutors are assigned homicide cases as soon as someone is killed. And it makes absolutely no sense that we would not not have any sort of communication with anybody until there's a person of interest. That might be months within the process, right? This is the home of, Baltimore is the home of witness intimidation, where the stop snitching mentality began. So why should we allow the families to just linger and not know anything? So again, it was a cultural sort of shift. I said from the top up and top down, this is what you guys are going to do. Every case that you are assigned to, you're now going to call in the next of kin. You're going to sit down with a victim witness advocate. We have a family bereavement center in the state's attorney's office, the only family bereavement center in the state of Maryland, where we offer lifetime grief counseling to folks, a therapist from the Family Bereavement Center, the district attorney or the state's attorney that's assigned to your case, the detective that's assigned to your case, and we're going to explain to you the way that the criminal justice system works before there's a person of interest, so that we can level set those expectations. In addition to that, we've made that a priority, right? Like, you have to prioritize. At the end of the day, if we do want to hold the worst of the worst accountable, and I do, you have to understand that it's not just on the police, it's not just on prosecutors. The way that we are able to secure justice for families is when the victims and witnesses come forward. We've increased the grant funding, I told you, by 27% in my office. We've doubled the size of the Victim Witness Services Division. We got a $2.4 million federal grant. I'm hoping that at some point it won't just be a grant, where we could better protect victims and witnesses, but making that a priority and letting people know that this is a priority is really important.
So I know that we have classes getting ready to come up. Let me say two things. One, I want to give everyone an opportunity to give a last word, but I also want to offer my sincere thanks for you coming today. Marilyn, I know you've been busy with what's going on in Baltimore. Larry, you got elected last night.
I know.
And Marilyn, Miriam, you're based in LA, so I know this was a hike. But let me get a last word from all of you. Miriam, what would you want to offer the students in terms of thinking about this work and thinking about the issues we've raised today?
Boy, that's a lot of pressure. So I
job.
guess, you're still number 2 on Larry's list. Millennials did not make number 1, but no, you try harder. No, I guess the only thing I would say in parting is this is important, and I've said it in some other contexts. My great team has heard me say it. I think we need to be a little bit impatient, and let's just not let the status quo remain the status quo, because every single day we keep doing things in the same way. There's another young person getting lost into the justice system. There's another family that we're destroying. There's another intergenerational cycle that we're helping to perpetuate. So I guess the last thing I would say, and I know that there's a tendency to be impatient among millennials perhaps to begin with, but this is an area where let's be impatient and really expect and demand things to change before another decade passes.
So when I came out of law school in '87 in the Bay Area, and HIV was absolutely ravaging that area, and we went in 10 years from 40 cases to 40 million cases in the United States, I was well aware as a young, expectant, hopeful civil rights lawyer, and so was my wife, as a young civil rights lawyer, that some of the most important civil rights issues of our time were going to be issues around HIV and also around LGBTQ issues, and we were right. You could see it coming. It was real. Well, I'm telling you right now that one of the biggest civil rights issues of your career is going to be in criminal justice. And I won't go through the stats, but it's absurd what has happened in the United States. So for those of you who have an interest and a dedication to civil rights, you should think about it. And you should think about it not in the ways that the right and these prosecutors have wanted you to think about it, because they wanted you to think about it in ways that kept them in office and advanced their careers. They wanted you to think that the only person who can become an elected DA is a former DA, that the only kind of DA there is someone who is thumping usually his, but maybe his or her chest and stamping their feet for more time, and that was a solution. It's not a solution. Even when we look at victims' rights, what we find out when polls are done of victims is that this binary notion that you're better, you're cured if someone gets tons of time is not what victims actually say that they want. So for those of you who really are thinking about a career in civil rights, I hope you will consider this. I would repeat to you what MLK said, which is if you want to fix a problem, you got to get your mind right, and you got to wrap your mind around the idea of a different kind of prosecutor, and then you can go to krasnertransition.com, which is Krasner transition.com. Thank you.
So first and foremost, I want to say thank you for allowing me to be on this esteemed panel. Miriam Krinsky and FJP is an awesome program that have been extremely supportive of my office, and I am eternally grateful for that support, because sometimes when you are out at the forefront of reform, you do feel like you're on an island by yourself. And so I am just really floored, because I'm right next to the newest district attorney, Larry Krasner, who is going to be out there with me, and I'm excited because I won't be alone. And then, of course, Professor Thompson, thank you so much, and all of you. You guys are our future. So the one thing I'd say is that, you know, I would mimic what has already been said, the awesome power of now. I always talk about, you know, every great movement towards progress in this country began with young people, unafraid to challenge the status quo in the pursuit of justice. Young people who never let any time, situation, or circumstance define their destiny. Young people who, in the words of Harriet Tubman, will reach for the stars and are able to change the world. So I can only tell you that systemic reform comes from within. So please consider the FJP program. Please consider a profession as a prosecutor. And even if you decide ultimately that you want to be a defense attorney, do a clinical on the prosecution side. It gives you a well-rounded sort of perspective, and then go for it.
So all I can say is keep an eye out on Baltimore, and I can't wait to see what's going to happen in Philly. Join me in thanking my panelists.